Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's online Parashah class. I'm Rabbi Ari Sachs of Congregation Beth Mordechai. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this week's class as we read Parashat Mattot, the next to last Torah reading in the book of Numbers. And in fact, I think this week's Torah portion is very timely, as in the 31st chapter, which is part of the triennial cycle, the first third of the Torah that is read in many conservative congregations in the world, includes a selection about the Israelites' war on the people of Midian. And in fact, that it deals in many ways both with the prescription of how that war should be conducted and then what the after effects are of that particular war. And given the events that are happening in Israel, that all of our hearts and our minds are with the Israeli people and with the Israeli army as they look to safeguard the Israeli people from Kassam rockets, that perhaps this Torah portion can give some insight into the issues faced by the Israeli army and the Israeli people by the conflict in the land of Israel and in Gaza. And in such, we're going to take a look at a few insights, I believe, that come from this week's Torah portion. So we turn to our good friend, Sefaria.org. To take a look at the very first selection from this 31st chapter. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, and the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Nekom nikmat b'nei Yisrael me'et hamidianim, achar te'asef el amecha. That you shall avenge the children of Israel on the Midianites. Afterward shalt thou be gathered unto thy people. And what's interesting from this phrase, before we get to exactly the command given by Moses, is that the command is given to avenge the Midianites. And why that's so interesting seems to come from a comment by way of Rashi, who says the following. He writes that me'et hamidianim, that the vengeance should take place upon the Midianites, velo me'et hamoavim, and that it should not be taken upon the Moabites. And part of the reason I think that this is so interesting has to do with the fact, well, why are we even concerning ourselves with the Moabites? What is it about the Moabites that would seemingly make us feel that that they're actually interested in, or that the Israelites should consider taking vengeance upon them? And as such, it seems that, if you think about what the Moabites had done, the Moabites were the ones who, the king of which, Balak, had sent Balaam to go and curse them. And as such, the Moabites seemingly were enemies of Israel. So why is it that the enemies of Israel, the Moabites, were not considered to be ones who should have vengeance taken upon them, but rather it is the Midianites? And as such, Rashi continues in his commentary, and be there in just a brief moment. Rashi continues and says, Shehamoavim nichnesu ledavar mechamat yir'ah, shehayu yireim mehem, shehiyu sholalim otam. And that the vengeance should not be given the Moabites, since the Moabites came into this from the aspect of fear. And in fact, if you turn to the story of the Moabites and Balak and Balaam, it actually says in a couple of ways that the Moabites were filled with yir'ah, that they were filled with fear. And it's because they feared the Israelites that they actually decided to do this action upon the Israelites and to curse them. Seemingly to say that if one is fearful of the Israelites, it means that they recognize the power of them, that there is an aspect of recognition that this is an enemy that we must be careful of. Now, perhaps that means that under certain circumstances that the Moabites, recognizing the power of the Israelites, would consider a different means to resolve their conflict. That is to say, if you know that one enemy is strong, then you look for a way to be able to defeat them differently than necessary through battle, which may have been the purpose of actually cursing them, to use the power of the gods to simply say that we want another way than simply through violence, because we know we're not going to win through violence, because we know that the Israelites are powerful. We want another way to be able to resolve this conflict. That's not to say that the Moabites were interested in peace necessarily, but that the Moabites recognized that the power of the Israelites was very significant to their tactics, and they're not simply just going to go after the Israelites based on sheer strength of power alone. So seemingly that they're filled with this fear, but it goes a little bit further in terms of where this sense of fear comes from. And I think that this is something that's very important. As it says that they were fearful of God and the Israelites, that they would plunder them. Thus it says in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 9, do not provoke the Moabites to war. Shelo ne'amar ela al titgar bam milchama. Now, this phrase actually is a very interesting one that I want to take a look at a little bit more closely. And as such, we're going to turn to Sefaria.org to be able to understand this verse a little bit more. Vayomer Adonai Elai, al tatsar et Moav ve'al titkar ba milchama. And God said, do not harass the Moabites and do not make war, do not contend with them in battle. Ki lo etein lecha me'artso Yerusha. Ki livnei lot natati et ar Yerusha. That for I will not give you of this land for a possession, but rather that I've given Ar unto the children of Lot for a possession. In other words, that the land belonging to the Moabites is not going to be going to the hands of the Israelites, meaning it is not the land that they intend to actually hold on to. It's going to be given to a different people, and these people that it belongs to are the children of Lot. And for that, if we take a look a little bit further at Genesis chapter 19, just to kind of remind ourselves of who Lot is in connection to the Moabites. Vataharena shte venot Lot ma'avihen, and when the two daughters of Lot became pregnant from their father, vateled habechira ben vatikra shemo Moav, hu avi Moav ad hayom. And that the eldest one had a child, and the name of which was Moab, and he was the father of Moab until this day. That is to say that according to our text, the Moabites are family, and that God said in dividing up all the different parts of land that the Israelites are not going to take this land because they belong to another member of the family, and the Israelites are not going to hold it. And I think that what's critical from this verse is to say that in dividing up territory, obviously you're going to go after territory that you don't see a valid claim on it by the other people, but rather you're going to not go into territory, or rather that you are not going to to try and destroy a people whose land is not, you don't necessarily consider to be your land. And why don't you consider it to be your land? Because they're part of your family. They're part of your own heritage, and you recognize that person's claim. And I think if you're hearing a little bit of the story of Israel and Gaza, I don't think that it's necessarily hidden at all. That is to say that in many ways the battle is first and foremost between who believes that the land is theirs. Israel, I believe, has shown in many ways that they recognize that Gaza is not necessarily their land. Hamas has not shown that they don't believe that Israel is their land. And that is to say even further that Hamas doesn't see Israel as part of the family of a part of its own family that has a claim to a land that is near to theirs. And it seems that Israel does most of the time, not going to get into whole debates as to whether it's not whether it's always, but that Israel does not see itself as trying to lay claim to Gaza. Rather, they're simply trying to prevent the attacks that are happening upon the land of Israel. And as such, that Israel must also see in that manner that the only way in which to not say, well, we have to just go in and take over the land and make it ours, is by recognizing the fact that in some capacity that the Palestinians who live in Gaza are part of the family, that they are from the descendants of Lot, that they are part of this larger family of, whether you want to call it Israel, whether you want to call it the Israelites, whether you want to call it from Abraham, whatever it is, and that only from that view, only if you see the other as being a part of who you are, will you say, I will give you that land. And maybe at this current time, it is very difficult for both the Palestinians, for Hamas, for Israel to be able to see each other in that light, but that only in that light is there going to be any sense of a ceasefire, of being able to say, all right, we're going to separate, we're going to have one land for one people and one land for the other one. So that sense of family that prevented of battle between the Israelites and the Moabites does not exist between the Israelites and the Midianites. And so only when you don't see the other as family, you see the other as the other, will you go into war with them. And this leads into, I think, another insight, which is, okay, let's assume for a moment that you're going to go into war with the people that you consider to be the other, that the Midianites are the other to the Israelites. How should one conduct yourself in that particular war? And for that, I'm going to turn again to this week's Parsha. וידבר משה אל העם לאמור, החלצו באיתכם אנשים לצבא, ויהיו על מדיין לתת נקמת אדוני במדיין. And Moses spoke unto the people, saying, arm ye men from among you for the war, that they may go against Midian, to execute the Lord's vengeance on Midian. In other words, that the Israelites are going to be doing nikmat Adonai, the Lord's vengeance on Midian. And that's a very important term that we're going to get back to in a few minutes. And who is going to be going? Elef lamate lachol matot Yisrael tishtachu letzava. Of every tribe 1,000 throughout all the tribes of Israel shall you send to war. Vayimaseru me'alfei Yisrael elef lamate shneim asar elef chalutzei tzava. So there were delivered out of the thousands of Israel 1,000 of every tribe, 12,000 armed for war. And just one other point that I want to bring up from here. Oh, here it is. Actually, it's in the very next verse. And who else shall be going in this war? Vayishlach otam Moshe elef lamate letzava otam ve'et Pinchas ben Elazar hakohen letzava uchlei hakodesh v'chatzotzrot hatruah biyado. And then Moses not only sent these 1,000 troops, or these 1,000 troops from each tribe, but also sent Pinchas, the son of Elazar Kohen, and all the holy instrument to be the priest for the war, and all of the holy instruments that were used in the war. In other words, in addition to all of the troops, and we'll get to the troops in a moment, that Pinchas is sent to war as well, almost as if Pinchas is a holy vessel. And what's interesting about Pinchas is that at the very end of the Torah portion a couple of weeks ago, into the beginning of the portion that bears Pinchas's name, known as Pinchas, that Pinchas, the son of Elazar Kohen, is the only one out of the Israelites to actually seek vengeance upon the Midianites and upon the Israelites who had fornicated together, meaning that they had illicit sexual relations, and that though none of the other Israelite leaders decided to go after the Midianites, Pinchas was the only one to do so. And he showed no mercy to the few Midianites and the Israelites who he actually went after. And in fact, he was rewarded by God at the very beginning of Parashah Pinchas for his zealous behavior, which leads into whole other questions as to whether that's the kind of leadership that we're looking for in our day and age. But regardless, Pinchas is sent at the head of this battle as the instrument of God, as the priest who has all of these holy vessels to lead the people upon this battle, almost to be God's representative during this battle with the Midianites. And I want to keep that in mind as we understand more about what the goal of the Israelites were in this war. And for that, I want to turn to the commentary from Ramban, known as Nachmanides, to be able to understand further what the Israelites were trying to do. Vayishlach otam Moshe elef lemateh, and Moses sent 1,000 from each tribe. And you can follow the English down below, and I'm going to try to translate as much as I can from the Hebrew. Lo shalach sham kol am hatzava. Moses did not send the entire nation to fight. Ve'af al pi shehayu Midianim amrav ve'ha'arim betzurot gedulot me'od. And even though that there was that the Midianites had such large fortified cities, that Moses did not send all of the troops that he possibly could. In other words, he called up the reserves, but he didn't call up all the reserves. He actually seemed to send more of particular forces to go in, that these forces were not representative of the whole army. And the reason? Ve'hata'am ki anikshalim bivnot Moav hayu rabim ve'enam re'uyim lenikmat Adonai. And the reason is that those who had sinned with the daughters of Moab, speaking to what Pinchas had done in terms of going after the Moabite women and the Israelite men who came together with them. Hayu rabim ve'enam re'uyim lenikmat Adonai, and that there were so many of these Israelite men who had come together illicitly with these Moabite women that they were unfit for being able to take out this vengeance of God. Al ken bacharu anashim tzadikim v'yiduim l'shivtehem. And thus Moses only chose the righteous ones, the ones who were known, the ones who were very, you could say, well equipped to be able to fulfill this need of nikmat Adonai, of vengeance of God. V'hinei Moshe lo tziva otam ma ya'asu. And thus Moses did not tell them exactly what to do. Rak amar lahem latet nikmat Adonai b'Midian. But rather, as it says in our Torah portion, that rather to simply make this vengeance of God upon Midian. V'chashav shelo yet. Oh, I'm going to actually get to that point in a second. So this part I think is fascinating, because what he's saying here is that first off, he's not sending out the entire army, because not all the army is fit for the job. Imagine, if you will, that you have 50,000 troops to send into battle, and that the kind of devastation, the kind of destruction that's going to happen by 50,000 troops, as opposed to if you send 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000 troops to be able to take action that is more appropriate for their numbers. That is to say that when you have a smaller group of troops, that you're able to be more precise in terms of the actions that you would take. So it is not a perfect analogy here, and I'll explain why in a second, but that if Israel is trying to, let's say, be more surgical in their operation in Gaza, that they don't need to send in so many troops, but rather to send in just the right number, the Anashim Tzadikim, the ones who are, you could say, righteous in the sense that they know what the real goals are of the war, and they understand the nuances of the kind of battle that they're fighting, to be able to go in and actually do that, as opposed to sending everyone together, in which case you can't necessarily control as much an entire group from being able to do things that you may not necessarily want them to be doing. Which is that the lesson from the Torah is that the smaller troop can actually be more precise in the goals that you're trying to set. Now, this analogy is not perfect, because I've been laying out how with fewer troops, Israel can go in to Gaza and try to limit as much the devastation that would be felt by the Palestinian people, the ones who are not a part of Hamas, the ones who are not terrorists trying to go into Israel or trying to harm Israel, that they can limit that kind of destruction. But that's not a perfect analogy, because in our Torah portion, the kind of action that it seems that God is wanting Israel to take is what's known as Nikmat Adonai, as the vengeance of God. And as we're about to see, the way Moses understands that to be is the following. Moses understands that feeling to be, pardon me one second. Is v'chashav shelo yashiru bahem sarid ufalit kenikmat Amalek or kenikmat Shiva Amamim, that they would let none of them remain or escape, as according to the verse from Joshua, like in connection with Amalek, or the vengeance in connection with the 7 nations of the land of Canaan. In other words, a scorched earth policy, destroy everything and everyone in their sight. That seems to be the message that Moses understands of what God is trying to do. And it seems from the context of our Torah that when God is speaking of having vengeance upon the people, it certainly seems that that's the kind of message that God is trying to hand over. But here's the interesting part. The interesting part is that in our Torah portion, remember, a Torah portion, that the people who are on their way, the ones who are righteous, the ones who are meant to be, who are supposed to know what Nikmat Adonai is, to the point where Moses does not need to specify exactly what they need to do, because he assumes that they know it. It's a troop that is led by Pinchas, by this man who did seek vengeance of God. That even this group goes into the land and spares the women, the children, and the cattle. How? Why? If Nikmat Adonai, if that vengeance is meant to reflect the sense that you're supposed to go in and go after all, why is it that these righteous people, the ones who are zealous for God, don't do so? And Moses, in fact, actually gets angry at them, seemingly the same way he gets angry at the Israelites for having immoral sexual relationships with the Moabite women. And at the end of the day, although he changes it around a little bit and says you should only keep the women who, or the female children who did not have any sexual relations with any of the Israelites, he changes it around a little bit, that Moses kind of allows this choice by the righteous fighters of Israel to stand insofar as saving those who in their minds, it seems, felt were innocent. That is to say that Moses may have had a certain understanding of innocence and guilt when it came to the Midianites. Everyone is guilty. There is no innocent. And in fact, if we think about what's going on in Israel and Gaza right now, I think that unfortunately, that there are many on both sides of the issue who believe that everyone on the other side is completely guilty. And yet, the ones who are actually going into the fighting, the ones who are on the ground, who are trying to uphold that sense of righteousness and correct behavior in their actions, the ones who were chosen specifically for that mission, they have a nuanced understanding, knowing that there's guilt, there's innocence, and there's probably some gray area in between, and that they're willing to do whatever they can to live within that gray area. And so I think that out of this lesson of war, out of this story of war within our Torah, are a couple of very important lessons that are applicable to what's happening today. The first is that you don't go to war with family. And right now, Israel, Hamas, the Palestinians, whoever you wanted to describe the two, don't really see each other as family. Who's right, who's wrong, it's not important for right now, because the most important aspect is that there is no sense of that everyone deserves a piece of the pie. Now, hopefully, at the end of the day, everyone will. And I certainly believe that Israel more so understands this even right now, because of the fact that it is more of a defensive war in regards to the attacks coming upon Israel, and that's why there is this response. And I believe with all my heart that the Israeli leaders do not believe that they want to go into Gaza and say this is ours now. But once both sides are able to fully see themselves as family, as part of that Abrahamic tradition, where you have the descendants of Abraham, the descendants of Lot, to realize that there is land that can be separated, that you don't not necessarily need to go to war with one another. But that if you go to war with one another, and even if you're going to war with another who you don't believe is to be family, that even then there is a possibility of seeing innocence and guilt as something separate, that not all are guilty, and as such to be able to live within that nuance and to be able to fight and to do what needs to be done in the most humane, in the most righteous manner possible. And as such, I can only hope and pray that this war will end soon, that both sides will see each other as family, but that until then, until that point, that the soldiers of the Israeli army be protected from harm, to be able to their best of their ability, as human beings can, to be able to know the difference between the innocent and the guilty, and that I truly believe that they fight according to that doctrine, and that at the end of the day, that the one day there will be peace in our homeland. Take care, Shabbat Shalom, and may peace be a hope for all people on this Shabbat. Take care and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.